Today is one of my on-again, off-again sermon series, Lies My Pastor Told Me, the Good Samaritan version. Why? Because this Good Samaritan text is one of these we think we know really well. In fact, it's one of the most recognizable texts to all Americans. If you poll them and you say, what do you know of the Bible? This is one of the things people know, especially if they're people who go to church. Like, who here has heard the Good Samaritan story before? Raise your hand. Everybody. Okay? And the problem is that what we've taught about the Good Samaritan text has sometimes been completely wrong and other times only getting a minor point rather than the main theme. So I want to walk you through the 3 sermons you have probably heard about the Good Samaritan and why they're not quite right. So the first sermon, I'm going to start oldest to newest. So the oldest sermon would be the sermon that our wonderful theological professors would have taught people to do really between the 1920s and the 1950s. Not the most glorious time for Lutherans, let's note. And what they would have taught is the following. They would have taught you to go into the story, go to the parable first, go look at the parable, pick on the priest and the Levite. They then would have brought out and said, the priest and the Levite had to follow all sorts of Jewish laws, including purity laws. And therefore, due to their overemphasis on the purity laws, they surely did not help this man who was injured, because they feared that if they touched the man, if he was dead or if maybe he was a non-believer or something, then it might be that they would be unclean and couldn't do their work in the temple, and therefore they were damned by the law. And we as Lutherans know we are damned by the law and saved by grace. Who here has heard that sermon? Right. That sermon is completely and absolutely inaccurate on so many fronts. So let's walk through the 4 big problems that sermon's got. Problem number 1. Man is going from Jerusalem to Jericho. Where is the temple? Jerusalem, right? These people, to get around the man, had to cross to the other side of the road, which means they're headed in the same direction the man was headed, which means they're headed to Jericho from Jerusalem, which means they weren't headed to the temple. So deciding that they clearly only avoided the man because they might be unclean due to temple worship doesn't make sense if they're headed away from the temple, not towards the temple. So problem 1. Problem number 2, because you could argue, well, maybe they were just on the wrong side of the road. I mean, walking, it doesn't matter, right? Okay, fine. Problem number 2 is even bigger. So the Jews at the time would have had the law, and the books of the law. They would have had the prophets, right? And they would have had the Psalms, all of which the priests and the Levites would have been knowledgeable and learned in. The Samaritans would have rejected many of the prophets and would have rejected the Psalms, or at least what we know of the Psalms and the prophets, but would have retained the law, even though they would have a thing here and there where they disagree, especially like where the temple should be. But they would have followed the law too. In fact, they would have followed the law more than the priests and the Levites. Because the priests and Levites also have the Psalms, also have the prophets. So if you were going to make a point about the law, you would have used anything but a Samaritan. And you could have picked all sorts of other people that were in the outs. You would have picked a Herodian who liked Herod and was a really bad Jew. Or a Roman who wasn't Jewish at all. You had lots of options of who you could have picked. But they picked a Samaritan, a person who would have even been more about the law. So arguing that it was sort of some anti-law thing, that becomes really problematic. Problem number 3 with that one. Lutherans, heads up, we don't think the law damns you. We think the law condemns you, and that's very, very different. So let's just walk through that so we don't get those two confused. Damnation means I'm going to hell. Condemnation means you look at all the rules in the Bible, go, man, I broke 15 of them this morning before I got to my coffee. And you realize you're not perfect. The law condemns us if we begin to believe we're perfect. It does not damn us. If it damned us, we would say not to follow the rules in the Bible. And yet the church has always done the opposite, right? The rules in the Bible are there to help us live better lives, But one of the other things they do is they are a reminder that, well, we all try to live better lives, and that is good. We are never going to live perfect lives. And that's why we need grace. Right? So this idea that the law damns is not a Lutheran idea at all. It's not a Christian idea at all, which begs the question of why did the theologians go down the road of damnation when they know that Luther talked about condemnation, not damnation? Well, it's probably because through the 20s to the 50s, as I noted earlier, was not the most gleaming, wonderful time for a theological academy in the Lutheran Church, folks. Guess what happened through that period of time? Oh yeah, the Second World War. Guess what was ripe all across the world at that point, even in the realm of the academy? Oh yeah, anti-Semitism. Oh, guess what? Who are we picking on? Oh yeah, the two Jewish people in the story. That sermon isn't just bad, isn't just wrong, isn't just not following the text at all. It's a dangerous sermon. Because it's an openly anti-Semitic sermon. So I caution against that entire road. Because it ain't Lutheran, it ain't Christian, it ain't biblical, it ain't much of anything besides anti-Semitic. Second sermon. Luckily enough, the Theological Academy by the 60s starts to move, actually late 50s I should say, starts to move, and with that comes a movement on this story. The movement on this story then has the preacher say, let's still keep looking at the Levite, let's look at the priest, still got the assumption that's where the meat of the story is about. And what we're going to tell you is, listen, these people know the law. They know that in Leviticus it says that they should go help the person because it says in Leviticus, your neighbor is the other and everyone closer to you than the most distant person. Okay, which means everybody, right? That's a fancy legal way of saying it's everybody. Everyone's your neighbor. And yet, these two people who would have been learned in Leviticus fail to live up to the thing they're preaching. And then your sermon would take a natural curve towards don't be a hypocrite. Don't be a hypocrite like those two. Okay? We've all heard that sermon? Good Samaritan, don't be a hypocrite. It's not bad. It's not bad advice. All of us fight with hypocrisy. It's one of the natures of being a fallen human. We all struggle with that. If you think you have never been hypocritical, ask your spouse, parent, or child. Especially teenagers are really good at pointing this out. They will take glee and joy, though that 40-year-old kid probably would too. Parents aren't usually too bad at it either. So, all of us have our moments of hypocrisy. So it's not bad advice. And it probably is something that the scripture is touching on, but it's honestly sort of a side thing that the scripture is touching on. I don't think it's the main point at all. Because if we just want to talk about hypocrisy, you have a lot better characters in that time to talk about. Talk about King Herod. Talk about any number of folks who are working with the Roman Empire while saying that they love the people of Israel. You know, King Herod loves the people of Israel. He's their king, and yet he's willing to kill people if they oppose him. That's what? That's hypocrisy. Right? Now, if you're, by the time, like, the 80s turned to the 90s and the 2000s, basically from this point on, the basic sermon you all would have heard would have been a sermon that basically goes, these two people, the priest and the Levite, failed at doing what they should have done. But instead of focusing on them, let's focus on the Samaritan, the person that everyone thought wouldn't stop, did. And the Samaritan, this person that the other two would have looked down on, did the right thing and helped their neighbor. We've all heard that sermon, right? Now that sermon's not wrong, it's not even inaccurate, but here's my problem with that sermon. It's great as a kid's sermon. It's basically what my kid's sermon was, if you guys were listening. But as adults, the world's more complicated than that. What do I mean? Well, I went to LSTC, which is on the south side of Chicago. Any of you who know the south side of Chicago know that that is a really impoverished area that has all sorts of endemic issues. Okay? And one of those issues is an endemic issue of poverty. And as you go in towards the university, you're going to run into a situation where there will be people on the side of the street asking for money. Okay? Now, I will tell you, having worked on the south side of Chicago, most of those people on the side of the street in the south side of Chicago are not con artists. They are people who are truly in need, who are truly starving, trying to feed themselves or their kids or who knows what. Okay? But there's another reality of the person on the side of the street. The gangs in Chicago are strong. Most of the south side of Chicago is divided territorially between one gang or another. There are a few cross sections down there on the south side of Chicago where a gang does not perceive itself as owning that territory. What it means is if you're on the side of the street and you are asking for money, you've already probably been approached, if you've been there more than a day, by the local gang who has let you know that they are willing to go ahead for 50% of what you bring in to go ahead and protect you from them beating you up. Because they're magnanimous that way. They run extortion rackets on these poor folks who are trying to survive. But what does that mean morally for you, the person in the car? If you give that person $1, 50 cents of that will go to help someone in need. And 50 cents of that will go to the local gang who is going to buy drugs and guns. Now, I don't know. I'm not a good enough moral theologian or ethicist to figure out what the right answer is to do, but I can tell you that's complicated, right? Because that 50 cents that you give to the gang is going to go ahead and create violence and oppression that contributes to the overall cycle of poverty, which landed that person there. So as much as you're helping that person maybe get out of poverty, you're helping someone else into it. I have no clue what the right answer is of do you hand the person the $1, but I can tell you it's complicated, right? That's the danger with the Sunday school level theology if you're an adult. It's fine if you're a kid. As adults, we all know the world's more complicated than that. Not everyone on the side of the road needs our help. Not everyone who says they need our help needs our help. Rescuing someone may not actually be helping in cases, right? It's really complicated. It's really hard. The world is more shades of gray than black and white most of the time on stuff like this. I know this, you know this. So then what is the lesson? What should we be focusing on? I think the problem is the parable is so good that we miss the parable's point. Because the point isn't the parable. The point is the questions before. So let's take a moment and concentrate on the part that no one talks about. The part is that we have a lawyer. Now, I do love you lawyers out there, before I get started. I really do. Here's the thing about lawyers. I will tell you right now, I have met many people with great artistic talent in the world of language. But we all, as regular people who are not super duper artists in language, the thing we don't get is that if you go to a university and you want to find the person who is most talented with language, don't go to the fine arts department. You do not want the people writing books and screenplays and all that sort of stuff. No. They are not the true language artists. The true language artists, law school. You don't believe me? Open the next time your phone updates itself and it says, do you agree to the terms of service? Say, I want to read that. Start reading. And what you will quickly learn is that lawyers have a magical ability. They can both talk so obtusely about an issue that you have no clue what they're even talking about, while at the same time talk so precisely that once you've agreed to it, you will never be able to wiggle your way out of the agreement you just made. Right? Find me anyone at the fine arts school that can do that. Okay? That lawyer is a canon lawyer. He knows the entire world of Jewish law. He's a Jewish lawyer over canon law. So what he does is he's asking simple bar mitzvah level question of what's the first commandment. Jesus is like, fine, I got my bar from I went ahead and got through all that. Here's the first commandment. Love your God with all your heart and all your mind and all your soul, and your neighbor as yourself. the lawyer comes back. By the way, if a lawyer ever asks you a really innocent, easy question and you answer and they immediately have another follow-up question, you are in trouble. Okay, just heads up, life hack. So follows up with, well, who's my neighbor? Now, this is one of these meta levels because Leviticus, which is one of the parts of law, in fact, it's like one of the core parts that the lawyer would have known, has an answer to that question. Therefore, the lawyer knows that Jesus knows that the lawyer knows the answer to the question that the lawyer is asking Jesus. It's very meta, guys. And Jesus then responds with the parable. He answers the question not with a, well, look at Leviticus, dude. He answers with the parable. And I think it's important because he's turning the tables on the lawyer. See, the lawyer started with an ingenuine or not genuine question of what do I need to do to be saved? Jesus is reframing the whole thing. Because what he's basically telling the lawyer with the parable is to say, you're asking the wrong question. See, the two people, for whatever reason, that they did not go and help the guy on the side of the road, even though they knew that Leviticus commands them to do it, at some level, to get there, had to have said to themselves, what happens to me if I stop walking? If I intervene, what happens to me? The Samaritan doesn't. He immediately responds with pity. It says it right there. Therefore, the Samaritan responds by saying, I wonder what happens to this person if I don't. Too often, people's spirituality gets caught up in this world of wondering, what do I need to do to be saved? The question the lawyer asks. What Jesus is turning the tables and posing to all of us is the question, what would your life look like if you lived as someone who is saved? So I pose that question to you today. Examining your spiritual life, examining how you live your life. What is the driving force of why you do what you do? Are you closer to where the lawyer is, of living a life in hopes of being saved? Or are you living your life as someone who knows you are? Amen.